The metal around my wrist was cold, but that was not the part one remembered most. What stayed with me was my wife's back. Evelyn Brooks, CEO of Brooks Global, did not watch the officers close the cuffs. She had already turned away, as if the scene behind her were an inconvenient piece of office noise. Her assistant, Claire Bennett, stepped close and handed her a paper cup of coffee. Evelyn lifted one elegant hand to take it while two police officers walked me across the polished marble lobby of Brooks Tower. The floor reflected everything: black shoes, pale ceiling lights, employees pretending to study their phones, and the clean hem of Evelyn's blazer. She did not turn. Not once. That told me more than any argument could have. This was not a moment of anger. It was not a panicked misunderstanding, not a wife reacting too fast because she was hurt or afraid. This had the calm shape of something filed away months ago and retrieved exactly when it became useful. My name is Daniel Carter. I was 34 years old, an architecture consultant by training, and, according to the complaint filed that night, a criminal accused of assaulting my wife's assistant. Here is what had actually happened. Claire had come into the home office and dropped a stack of folders across the floor. They were mine. 3 weeks of work for a private project that had nothing to do with Brooks Global and nothing to do with Evelyn. I bent down to help collect them. Claire's hand reached for the same folder at the same time. My palm brushed her wrist. That was all. She snatched her arm away as if I had burned her. 40 minutes later, she called my wife. 2 hours after that, Evelyn called the police. In the back of the patrol car, I did not shout. I did not beg the officers to listen. I did not cry. I watched the city pass beyond the window and made a list. Not a list of enemies. Not a list of people I wanted punished. I wrote down every decision of my own that had brought me to that seat. The first mistake was that I had married someone I admired instead of someone who truly knew me. The second was that I had confused being useful with being loved. The third was that when admiration slowly turned into invisibility, I had called it peace. The fourth was that I had stayed. By the time we reached the station, I had counted 11 mistakes. They were not grievances. They were choices, and they were mine. That difference mattered. Later, I would understand it was the first thing that saved me. The holding cell smelled of disinfectant, stale coffee, and old fear. 3 other men were inside. 2 slept with their heads against the wall. 1 stared ahead with the patience of someone familiar with this kind of room. I sat near the door and kept my hands on my knees. I had not made my phone call yet. I was entitled to one, and I was not going to waste it. For a long time, I thought of who I could call. Not a friend, I realized. I had almost none of my own left. There were Evelyn's colleagues, Evelyn's business circle, Evelyn's acceptable dinner guests. There were people who knew me as her husband, not as myself. My own social life had narrowed to almost nothing. Then I remembered Brian Miller, my university roommate. He was a structural engineer now, working for a mid-sized firm across the river. A good man. The kind of man who answered when the phone rang, even if years had passed. He picked up on the second ring. "Brian," I said, my voice rough. "I need a lawyer." There was a pause. "Daniel, it's 11 at night." "I know." This time the pause was longer. I heard him sit up. "Which station?" By 2 in the morning, David Lawson arrived. He was not Brian's regular lawyer. Brian had made calls of his own before coming to the station, and somehow he had found the kind of attorney people contacted when a problem had layers. David wore a charcoal 3-piece suit at 2 in the morning, as if sleep were optional and disorder were a personal failing. He sat across from me, opened a slim leather notebook, and did not waste a second on sympathy. He asked 11 questions in 8 minutes. He wrote everything down. Then he looked up. "You should be released by morning," he said. "The allegation is minor assault. If their evidence is Claire's statement and your wife's phone call, it will be weak. No visible injury, no neutral witness, no recording of the actual contact." He closed his pen halfway, then added, "Your wife is relying on you being too humiliated to fight this." I looked at him. She would have been right 3 years ago. He studied me. "And now?" "Now," I said, "I want to know what you know about Evelyn Brooks's company finances." His pen stopped. Then he wrote something longer than before. The corner of his mouth moved barely. "I think," David said, "this is going to be a useful relationship, Mr. Carter." They released me at 6:47 in the morning. The sky had not decided what color it wanted to be. It hung over the city in a dull pewter gray, damp and unfinished. I stood outside the station with a paper bag containing my phone, wallet, and watch. The air smelled like rainwater, drains, and fried food from a cart down the block. Brian was waiting by the curb. He handed me a vending machine coffee without saying anything. That was exactly the right thing to do. We stood there for a while. "She really called the police," he said at last. "Yes. For that. For that." He looked down. His face changed in slow weather systems. Disbelief, anger, then a controlled tightening of the jaw. "Where are you going?" It was a good question. The apartment belonged to Evelyn. Her name was on the lease. Her furniture was in the rooms. Her paintings were on the walls, expensive pieces I had never liked and never said I disliked. Going back there meant stepping into the role she had built for me. The corrected husband, the man who returned when he had been properly disciplined. I had performed that role for 3 years without understanding that the stage had been built for exactly that purpose. "Not the apartment," I said. "My place." "No, David has an office downtown. I'm going there first." David's office occupied the 6th floor of an understated building with river views and no obvious branding. That told me he did not need to advertise. At 7:30, he arrived carrying coffee from Proper Cafe. He saw me waiting on the hallway bench, unlocked the glass door, and led me inside. The office had one long table, shelves from floor to ceiling, and a window that looked out over the river, catching the first silver light of morning. He placed coffee in front of me and opened his notebook to the previous night's page. "You asked about Brooks Global," he said. "Before I answer, you should understand my field. I handle estate and corporate law. 6 months ago, a firm conducting due diligence for a possible acquisition partnership asked me to review materials related to Brooks Global. The review found anomalies." "What kind?" "Operational spending irregularities, executive discretionary accounts, repeated transfers that did not align with approved corporate purpose. In plain English, money has been moving out of the company very carefully for some time." I waited. "The acquisition talks collapsed," David said. "My firm declined further involvement. I never met Evelyn Brooks, but I saw the signatures authorizing the accounts." "Evelyn's?" "Yes." I did not feel surprised. It was more like hearing a lock click open in a door I had been staring at for years without seeing the keyhole. Her trips that never appeared on the corporate calendar. Claire's strange closeness to her. The way Evelyn's father, George Brooks, had once watched me at a family dinner, not with contempt, but with something much harder to understand. "Pity. I want everything you have," I said. "Every anomaly." David smiled the way a patient man smiles when the board finally becomes interesting. I spent the next 3 days at Brian's apartment. His wife, Hannah, was practical and kind in the cleanest possible way. On the first morning, she made soup, set it in front of me, and asked no questions. That silence was not avoidance. It was mercy. I slept on their couch. I woke early. I sat by their kitchen window with a notebook and began drawing the structure of my life from the ground up. What did I actually have? 12 years of architectural consulting experience. A portfolio Evelyn had once called impressive for someone without the right connections, which I now understood had never been praised. A small personal savings account she did not know about because 3 years earlier some stubborn instinct had kept me from combining every asset after the wedding. It was not much, but it was not nothing. I called my old firm, the consulting company I had left after Evelyn suggested, gently and repeatedly, that it would be complicated for her public image if her husband worked too closely with a competing network. I had resigned. Of course I had. At the time I called it a mutual decision. Naming it surrender would have forced me to admit what was already happening. Victor Harris, the director, answered himself. "Daniel," he said warmly, not at all surprised. "I wonder when you'd call." "I like to talk about coming back," I said. "Freelance first, if that works." "We have a cultural complex brief in Inchester," he said. 3 consultants turned it down. Tight budget. Difficult client. "I'll look at it. I saved it for you." I wrote the project name in my notebook and underlined it twice. On the 3rd day, David called. "I've arranged a meeting," he said. He did not explain immediately, which I was learning was how he signaled importance. "With whom?" "Chairman Thomas Whitaker." Everyone in business knew that name. Thomas Whitaker was one of those men who existed above visible power. He was not famous for charity galas or loud acquisitions. He was simply present behind serious deals, the name behind a name. 67 years old, still running his foundation and holding companies from a private residence. Why does he want to meet me? I asked. David's voice became very neutral. Apparently, he knew your father. My hand stopped over the notebook. My father had been an architect, though not the kind who appeared in magazines. He was the one who made impossible buildings work after the celebrated designers made beautiful problems. He understood weight, drainage, joints, and how walls met floors. He had died when I was 19. For 15 years, I had kept his old drafting table with me, wherever I lived, never once asking why I could not let it go. The meeting took place that Saturday afternoon in a private restaurant with no sign outside. David drove. Inside, the floors were stone, the tables were low and polished, and the rooms smelled of pine, cedar, and something slowly simmering. We were led to a private room, divided by paper screens. Afternoon light lay across the floor in soft rectangles. Thomas Whitaker was already seated. He was not physically imposing. His authority came from stillness. He sat as if the chair had been made for him, and he had no need to prove anything to anyone. When I entered, he looked at my face first. "Daniel Carter," he said, "you have your father's jaw." I sat across from him and let the sentence settle. "You knew him for 32 years. He poured tea himself, first for me, then for David, then for himself. We once built a community center together," he said. "The city wanted to demolish it for a parking structure. Your father stopped them. He never told me he knew you. He would not have. Why? Your father believed influence was most useful when it did not announce itself." He looked at me for a long moment. "I watched your career from a distance," he said, "and I watched what happened to it." There was no pity in his voice, no performance of kindness. That made it harder to hear. "I have a proposal," he continued. "Not charity. I want that understood. I did not invite you here to give you a gift." He set his cup down. "My foundation has a residential arts complex underway. Community spaces, small performance venues, programming rooms. The architect resigned 6 weeks ago for personal reasons. I need someone who understands buildings not as career monuments, but as places people actually have to live inside." "What are the conditions?" I asked. His mouth curved slightly. "That you do the work as yourself. Not as Evelyn Brooks's husband. Not as anyone's appendage. Yourself." I thought of my father's drafting table, of its worn edges and ghost marks. "Yes," I said. "The first thing Evelyn did when I did not come home was send Claire to look for me. That told me 3 things. Evelyn did not want to come herself. She was not worried enough to call the police again, and she still preferred to use Claire as a censor rather than speak to me directly. Claire arrived at Brian's building on the 4th day, wearing a pastel coat and a concerned expression. She asked the doorman whether Mr. Carter had been seen there. The doorman said no one by that name lived in the building, which was technically true. Brian's apartment was registered under Hannah's family name. I had not planned that. It was luck, or the same instinct that had saved my separate bank account. I was not hiding. I want to be exact about that. I was simply no longer reporting my location to people who had used access to harm me. Within 48 hours, David filed a response to the assault complaint. He cited the lack of physical evidence and 2 contradictions in Claire's statement. She had first told the responding officer the contact was on her left wrist. In the written statement, it became the right. A small contradiction can mean many things. Panic, confusion, or a memory being built too quickly for the lie to dry. If I push it now, David told me, they withdraw quietly and we gain very little. If we let it sit, then file a counterclaim for false reporting, her lawyers have a problem. Then wait, I said. How long? Until the discomfort is useful. He made a note. On the 6th day, I moved into a small studio arranged through Whitaker's Foundation as part of the project accommodation package. Thomas was careful to say it was not a gift. It was standard for on-site consultants, and I could leave whenever I wished. The studio was on the 2nd floor of an old building with a single east-facing window. The floor creaked in 3 specific places. I learned them by the 2nd night. I brought almost nothing from the apartment. My phone, my notebook, my watch. and my father's drafting table. Brian helped me collect it while Evelyn was at a board meeting. I carried it up the narrow stairs myself and placed it beneath the east window. That night, I sat down and drew my first real sketch in 2 years. Not a client rendering, not a brief, not a drawing required to satisfy someone else. It was an idea for a community room whose acoustics could hold quiet conversation in a children's choir without sacrificing either. I drew for 4 hours without checking the time. When I finally stopped, the studio was cold, midnight had passed, and 6 sheets of paper were covered in work. Somewhere across the city, Evelyn was probably asleep, assuming I would come back once I was ready to apologize properly. That had been the rhythm of our marriage. I would offend in some invisible way. She would apply a consequence. I would apologize until the air pressure returned to normal. We had done it 17 times in 3 years. This was the 18th. Except this time, I did not apologize. I drew. I met Grace Whitaker on a Wednesday morning at the construction site. She stood in what would become the main community hall, holding a paper bag and talking on the phone. She wore an oversized burnt orange sweater, wide trousers, and sneakers, as if she had dressed for a more interesting world than the one most people occupied. She was Thomas Whitaker's granddaughter and the cultural programming director for the project. She ended her call, turned, saw me in the doorway with drawings under my arm, and said, "You look like you've been sleeping on a couch." "A very good couch," I said. "I'm Grace," she said. She did not add the surname. "What did your grandfather tell you about me?" "That you were probably the right person for this and definitely inconvenient." I considered that. Accurate. Good. She sat cross-legged on the concrete and opened her bag. Inside were 2 coffees and a stack of notes. "Seat. I'll tell you what the spaces need to do. You tell me what is structurally possible. Then we argue until we have a brief." We argued for 3 hours. She wanted the main hall to work acoustically without ugly panels. Annoying, but possible if the ceiling formed sound the way a cupped hand held water. She wanted a reading alcove that felt like a pocket. She wanted children to be able to see into the performance space from their room, so small people could watch large things happen through a window. Her requests were unusual, but precise. Emotional, but not vague. By the end, I had 2 new pages of sketches, and she had 3 pages of notes filled with sharp, enthusiastic markings. As we packed up, she asked, "How long have you been drawing like this?" "Consulting? 12 years. "No, drawing like the page is answering you back." I thought about it. Since I was 20, I stopped for about 2 years. "What happened 2 years ago?" "I got married." She nodded as if I had just explained a moderately complicated structural failure. Evelyn made first contact in the 2nd week. Not directly. The message came from an unfamiliar number, but the wording was too controlled to belong to anyone else. "I think there has been a misunderstanding. When you're ready to talk properly, I would like that opportunity." There was no apology. It was an open door performed by someone refusing to admit she had slammed on my face. I read it twice, placed the phone face down, and returned to my sketch. The message was not meaningless. It was data. It told me she had expected me home by now. It told me Claire had failed to locate me. It told me Evelyn had not yet spoken seriously to a divorce lawyer, because any competent divorce lawyer would have told her not to contact me. She was still running the old script. I retreated, absorbed the punishment, and returned. Instead, I spent 40 minutes on the phone with David reviewing the divorce filing he had been preparing. "She will try to settle privately," he said. "A contested divorce exposes too much." "Hold the filing," I said. "For how long?" "Until waiting hurts her more than it hurts me." The Inchester brief arrived the following week. I worked on it from 6 to 9 most mornings before going to the Whitaker site. My body remembered real work immediately, as if competence had been waiting under the skin. Grace came to the site almost every day. We developed a rhythm. She described how a space should feel. I explained what would make it feel that way. Then we argued over the distance between those 2 things, which was usually smaller than either of us expected. One afternoon, while the light shifted across the unfinished floor, she asked, "Do you miss your old life?" I took the question seriously. "I miss believing I was happy," I said. "That is not the same thing." She wrote that down. I did not ask why. Meanwhile, the story spread. My arrest had not made the news. Evelyn had enough control to keep it quiet. But a CEO's husband being taken out of the company lobby in handcuffs was the kind of thing that traveled through offices without needing social media. Brian heard from someone in Brooks Global's marketing department that there were now 3 internal opinions. Some believed I had done something wrong. Some believed Evelyn had overreacted. And a quiet third group believed Claire was at the center of something no one had named yet. The third group interested me. I told Brian to do nothing. No correcting. No defending. No leaking. Let Claire's story exist unsupported. Let people ask their own questions. On the 17th day, Evelyn's father called. George Brooks had retired 8 years earlier and lived quietly with a garden he maintained himself. Our relationship had always been one of respectful coexistence. He had not opposed the marriage, but he had watched me with the attention of a man storing details. Daniel, he said. He had never called me anything more familiar than that, and I respected him for it. I heard about the Whitaker Project. News travels. Thomas Whitaker is not a name people miss. A pause. I'm glad, he said. Not for the reason you may think. I am glad because you are building something. Another pause. Evelyn is not who I hoped she would become. That is all I will say. Thank you, I said, and I meant it. It was small, exact, and more generous than he owed me. That evening, Grace sent a voice note. The reading alcove mock-up actually feels like a pocket. You were right about the curve. Do not be smug. I sent back, I'm not smug. I am accurate. She replied, that is the smuggest possible answer. I put the phone down and realized I was smiling at the ceiling. In the third week, Evelyn came in person. She arrived alone at the site on a Tuesday morning. No Kleide. That was a deliberate signal. She stepped out of a black car and crossed the gravel toward me while I reviewed load calculations with the foreman, Ben Wallace. I saw her from 30 yards away. I finished my sentence about the east wall reinforcement before turning. She stopped 2 paces from me. Her posture was perfect. It always was. But I knew her tells. The thumb pressed lightly into the knuckle of her index finger, the half-second delay before the controlled smile appeared. She was uncomfortable. You look well, she said. Site work suits me. I would like to talk. Properly. About what specifically? The smile thinned. She was used to conversations beginning with my apology. Without it, she had to improvise. About what happened. About where we are. Where we are, I said, is that you filed a false assault complaint against me using your assistant, and I have spent the last 3 weeks remembering I have an architecture career. Which part would you like to discuss? I said it evenly. No anger. No raised voice. False is a strong word, she said. It is the accurate one. I turned back to the blueprint table. If you want to discuss terms, have your lawyer contact David Lawson. His office will make time. She stood there for 4 seconds. Maybe 5. Then I heard her heels retreat over the gravel. Ben Wallace, who had seen enough construction sites to understand when silence was wiser than speech, waited a moment and pointed to the drawing. About the east wall, he said. Yes, I replied. Let's continue. In the 4th week, 2 things changed the shape of everything. First, David called on a Thursday evening. The Brooks Global irregularities are larger than I first told you, he said. How large? If accurate, large enough for criminal embezzlement. Not an internal correction. Not a civil dispute. I sat down. And the destination accounts? Not Evelyn's. The money moves through executive accounts bearing her signature, but the routing structures point elsewhere. One name appears as secondary signatory on 3 of them. I already knew before he said it. Claire Bennett. I sat with that for a long time. Claire was not simply an assistant who had been used. The complaint, the access, the closeness to Evelyn, the financial routes. These were not the habits of a loyal employee. They were the moves of a partner, not the kind I had first imagined. The second thing happened Friday morning. Thomas Whitaker came to the site with a lean man in a government-adjacent suit. They spoke privately for 15 minutes. After the man left, Thomas found me by the east wall. He studied the curved ceiling frame for a full minute. A regulatory review is being opened, he said. Financial irregularities at a mid-sized corporate group. I'm not involved. I mention it only because timing is sometimes useful information. Understood. I did not engineer this, he said, looking directly at me. That is not how I operate. I know. I also think some things complete themselves. He looked again at the ceiling. The acoustic curve is very good. It was disputed. Did you win? Eventually, he nodded once, as if I had answered more than the question. The news broke the following Tuesday. Not on the front page. Not yet. A financial industry publication ran 2 cautious paragraphs about a regulatory inquiry into operational accounts at an unnamed mid-sized corporate group. The company was not named, but in the circles that mattered, that kind of article was a fire alarm in a building everyone had been pretending did not smell of smoke. Brian forwarded it at 8:47. Is this what I think it is? I replied, probably. At 9:15, David called. Her lawyers contacted my office before the markets opened. They want to discuss settlement. Tell them we will, I said, after we file the counterclaim for false reporting. That will make them uncomfortable. Yes, I said. That is the order of things. I was clear with myself about what I wanted. I did not want to destroy Evelyn. I did not want a public humiliation or a ruin with an audience. I wanted out. I wanted what was mine. I wanted the assault record removed. And I wanted her to understand completely what she had done and what she had lost. Not because I needed her to suffer, because I would not accept an ending where she remained confused about her own role in it. The counterclaim was filed that afternoon. David handled the paperwork with his usual exactness, handing me each page before I signed. Outside his office window, the river shone silver and indifferent. There will be pressure to withdraw quickly, he said. They will offer more money. Let them think overnight. The regulatory inquiry will occupy their attention. Then they will be occupied with both things at once. David made a note, then looked up. As your lawyer, I need to say this. You have more leverage than anyone realizes. The irregularity documents, the false reporting counterclaim, and Thomas Whitaker's institutional weight behind your current project. Any one of those would matter. Together, you do not have to be reasonable. I know, I said. I am choosing to be. He wrote that down too. Evelyn agreed to a settlement meeting the following Thursday. Neutral ground, a private hotel conference room at noon. She came with 2 lawyers and the kind of stillness a person wears after compressing a terrible week onto the surface by force of will. I came with David and 4 years of being invisible, which turned out to have been 4 years of watching. The first 20 minutes were procedural. Asset pools, filings, withdrawals, expungement language. Her side wanted the false assault complaint buried quietly. I was willing under very specific conditions. I let David handle the legal machinery. I watched Evelyn. She looked at me twice. The first glance was familiar, the old assessment from across dinner tables, deciding whether I was a complication or a variable to be managed. The second came when David placed the financial summary on the table. Her eyes moved from the document to me. For the first time in 3 years, something unguarded crossed her face. How long have you known? She asked. Long enough. I am not using it to extract divorce terms, I said. The regulatory inquiry exists independently of anything we sign today. It is not mine to stop. What I saw then was not remorse exactly. It was not even fear. It was recognition. She had finally understood that someone she dismissed possessed something she could not imitate. Restraint that came from strength, not weakness. My terms are simple, I said. The apartment is yours. I do not want it. 12% of the joint asset pool, which is legally mine, and not a cent more. Full expungement of the assault record. A signed statement from Claire confirming the incident was mischaracterized. Your lawyers may word it carefully, but the substance must be accurate. And an uncontested divorce. Her lead lawyer began to speak. Evelyn raised one hand, and he stopped. Those terms are less than you could demand, she said. I know. They are what I want. She was silent for a long time. Then she said, draft it. The settlement took 11 days to finalize. 11 days of lawyers exchanging language about language. 11 days of David calling to ask whether I wanted to push harder on a clause, and me usually saying no. On the day it was signed, David and I ate dinner near his office. He poured 2 glasses and slid one toward me. In 15 years, he said, I have never had a client so consistently ask for less than he was entitled to. I asked for what I needed, I said. That is not the same as less. He considered that. No, he said, it is not. My assault record was expunged 10 days later. The following week, I registered a consulting practice under my own name. Daniel Carter Architecture. Not a firm, not an agency, just my name on the door. It felt like more space than any apartment I had ever lived in. Claire Bennett's role in the Brooks global irregularities became part of a formal investigation 8 days after the divorce was finalized. The story that emerged through filings and financial press was more complicated than my first assumptions. Claire had not been a passive beneficiary. She had helped design a quiet, sustained embezzlement structure over 3 years, using Evelyn's authority and her own trusted position to route money through minor accounts. Evelyn's signature was on documents. Whether she understood every destination became a legal question. I did not follow the proceedings closely. It was no longer my story to judge. What I understood, looking back, was that Evelyn had married me partly because I seemed uncomplicated. No powerful family, no dangerous network, no competing ambition loud enough to threaten her center. I made the margins of her life more livable. That calculation was not exactly malicious. It was simply wrong. She had not understood what people become when diminished quietly for long enough. She had not accounted for a man with a good drafting table, 12 years of structural thinking, and 6 weeks alone with his own life. The Whitaker Arts Complex opened on a clear Sunday in early spring. The night before, I stayed until 11 for the final walkthrough. Every space we had fought for was there. The main hall with its curved acoustic ceiling, the reading alcove shaped like a pocket, the children's viewing window set at exactly the height where a 7-year-old on tiptoe could see the stage. The drainage worked. The east wall was solid. The sight lines were right. At 10:30, after the last worker had gone, I walked through the building alone. Entrance, main hall, performance corridor, reading alcove, children's room, courtyard window. In the center of the courtyard stood an old ginkgo tree. It had been there before the building. The original brief did not require keeping it. The budget did not anticipate it. I designed around it anyway. In one of my father's old project notes, I had once found a line written in the margin. When in doubt, build around what is already alive. On opening day, Thomas arrived first with the foundation board. Grace came 15 minutes later with 3 community arts organizations and began introducing people to their future rooms with the fierce delight of someone who had waited a year for this. I stood near the entrance and watched the building receive its first people. I had always believed buildings were not real until people moved through them. First occupation is the moment architecture stops being an idea. Thomas came to stand beside me as children ran through the main hall, their voices rising into the acoustic curve exactly as the geometry had promised. Your father would have been pleased, he said. I hope so, I said. Then I added, he would have asked about the drainage. Thomas laughed, a real laugh, not polished, not social. It made him look younger for a moment. Later, Grace found me in the reading alcove. She sat inside the curve, beneath the small high window. I sat at the other end. Our shoulders almost touched. It feels like a pocket, she said. Yes, you were right. I know. Do not be smug. 2 months later, the Inchester brief was delivered. Victor Harris held a review session with 2 structural engineers and the client, a community arts coalition led by a 62-year-old woman who studied my drawings the way my father used to, not admiring the appearance first, but following the logic of care inside the lines. After the session, she held one drawing up to the window light. This is the kind of architecture that knows what a room is for, she said. I received the commission 2 weeks later. Full scope, design, supervision, delivery. The budget was tight. The client was demanding in a way people are demanding when they care deeply about what is being built. That was my favorite kind of difficult. Daniel Carter Architecture, 8 months old, had 3 active commissions and a 4th under discussion. Around the same time, the initial regulatory proceedings involving Brooks Global concluded. Claire was formally charged. Evelyn was found to have signed documents without full knowledge of their final routing destinations. The legal language was careful. Whether that reflected the truth or a negotiated version of it was not mine to decide. I noted it and moved on. One Friday in June, Brian Hanna had me over for dinner. Hanna cooked too much, which was the point. We stayed late talking about nothing important, which is one of the most important kind of talking there is. At the end of the night, Brian walked me to the building entrance. You look like yourself, he said. As opposed to what? He thought about it. As opposed to the version of you I had not seen in a while. I walked home from the subway slowly. The night was mild. The streets near the arts complex smelled faintly of ginkgo leaves. I had nowhere to be except where I was going. The studio was dark when I arrived. I turned on the lamp by the drafting table. The east window held the city in small, glittering pieces. I made tea and sat down. For a long time, I thought the question was whether I could survive being discarded, or whether I could get revenge on someone who wronged me. Those are never the interesting questions. The real question had been this: do you know who you are when the person who decided your value is no longer in the room? The answer, it turned out, was yes. I always had. Later, Grace told me more about Claire. Her own network moved quietly through the city in the way her grandfather's did, built not on spectacle, but on the accumulated goodwill of decent people. Claire had not begun as a mastermind. She had begun as a capable 24-year-old from a modest background, excellent at her job, and excellent at reading what people wanted from her. For a year, that was all she was. Then she found Evelyn's blind spot, the absolute certainty of Evelyn's own judgment. And she made a choice. I'm not interested in excusing her. I'm interested in accuracy. The accurate version is not that one villain used one innocent woman. It is less comfortable than that. Two people each decided the end they wanted justified the means available. One had a husband. One had a signature. Both decided someone else's cost was an acceptable price. The difference between me and either of them is not that I am noble. It is that I have thought about load-bearing walls long enough to know this. When you remove the thing you think is unnecessary, sometimes it is the thing holding the structure up. In late June, Grace met me in the courtyard to review the programming schedule for the rest of the year. We sat on the low stone bench by the ginkgo tree with her notes and my coffee. My grandfather wants to know if you will consider the West Extension, she said. I will look at the brief. He said you would say that. He knows me reasonably well. She looked at me, and the expression was not her usual professional assessment. It was the same look she had given me in the reading alcove on opening day, when the light came through the high window and neither of us hurried to speak. I told him you were good at this, she said. At architecture, at people, the way you design for them. Not for who they pretend to be, for who they actually are. The clumsy ones, the small ones who want to see big things. I looked at the ginkgo tree. I had a good teacher, I said. He left good notes. She nodded and did not push. We worked for an hour, arguing and refining until the schedule became better than either of us had brought to the bench. When she stood to leave, she paused. I like working with you, she said. It was a simple sentence. It was not a small one. I like working with you too, I said. She left, and I stayed on the bench with my coffee, listening to the building behind me do what buildings are supposed to do. Hold the people inside, keep out what should be kept out, and make the space between walls feel like belonging. This is the final shape of the story, and I want to be honest about what kind of ending it is. It is not triumph. Triumph implies a contest with a clean winner, and I no longer think that way. It is not peace in the tidy sense, where everyone is forgiven and every loose thread is tied. It is something better. It is true. Evelyn now runs a smaller company under restructured governance, with a compliance officer who reports to the board instead of to her. People who still move in those circles say she is more careful than she used to be. Whether that means she is better in the way that matters, I do not know. I have stopped wondering. Thomas Whitaker attended the planning meeting for the West Extension in August. He said nothing for 40 minutes while I presented the first concepts. At the end, he pointed to the courtyard plan. It is like the first one, he said. Yes, keep doing that. I intend to. He still calls once a week to ask about the work. Sometimes, near the end of the call, he mentioned something my father once said, briefly, without ceremony, like handing me back something I had unknowingly left behind. And me? I still live in a studio with the east window. My father's drafting table is beneath it. The floor still creaks in 3 places. I know them all, and sometimes I step on them deliberately, because the creak of a known floor is the sound of a place that is yours. Grace and I are in the early stages of something I do not want to name too quickly. We both know buildings well enough to understand that structure's worth keeping need time to settle before weight is placed on them. What I know now is this. I was never the man Evelyn thought I was. I was never someone who could be domesticated by dismissal, diminished by a holding cell, or ended by a turnback. I was the man with the drafting table, the list of 11 mistakes, and the stubborn conviction that when something is alive, you build around it. My father knew it. Thomas suspected it. Grace sees it every time she writes. You are just accurate, in a margin of something important. And here, in this studio, in this particular morning of a life that belongs entirely to me, I know it too. The kettle begins to sing. I turn from the window. I begin.